Welcome to Verse by Verse Bible Teaching. My name is Chris. Today we're continuing our study in Daniel. We're in Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 49. This is where Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And because this passage has a lot of prophetic significance, I also did a video as well as the audio for this one, so you can check that out at the website versebyversebibleteaching.com. We left off last time as Daniel was standing before the king of Babylon's throne, and his very life was on the line, because Nebuchadnezzar had had a dream which he knew was very important, but he didn't know why. He considered this dream too important for its interpretation to be left to chance. So he commanded that whoever would tell him the interpretation of his dream must also be able to tell him what the dream was in the first place. He came to the decision that his dream-interpreting advisors were unable to do this, and he ordered them all killed. Daniel, who was not present at the time of this order, only realized that he, as well as the other wise men, had been ordered killed when his executioner shows up at the door. To make a long story short, Daniel calls a prayer meeting with his young and God-fearing friends. God gives him a vision as they prayed all night, and Daniel is rushed to the king's throne. And in verse 31, where we will begin, Daniel stands in front of King Nebuchadnezzar, who is waiting to see if this kid, Daniel was probably in his teens at the time, actually knew the dream or not. I'll start by reading the first 3 verses, and then I will go over them in more detail. 31. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, and its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So the first part of Nebuchadnezzar's dream involved a statue which was made of 5 different materials: the head made of gold, the chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Stephen R. Miller says the following of this phrase, its form was awesome, in verse 31. Quote, the word awesome is from a root word meaning to fear. Nebuchadnezzar was frightened by the statue. This certainly is understandable, for the huge image would have stood like a dazzling colossus before the king. So we see that Nebuchadnezzar's dream was of a giant statue. We're not told exactly how big the statue was in his dream, but the image that Nebuchadnezzar built in the next chapter, which he forced everyone to worship, may have been patterned after this one, and the structure of that was 90 feet tall. I'll read the next 2 verses before going into much more depth. Verse 34, you watched while a stone was cut out with hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Then the iron and clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. There are 2 things in this verse that are worth noting before we begin reading Daniel's interpretation of this dream. The first is that the stone that Nebuchadnezzar watched being cut out with hands, we will see in verse 44, means that this rock is not of human origin, but rather it is from God and distinct from the other elements in this dream in that regard. The second thing worth noting is that the rock strikes the statue on its feet, not its toes. I will argue later that the feet and the toes are described as one cohesive unit. They are still a part of the last empire, that of the legs and iron, but that both the feet and the toes together represent a latter part of that kingdom, which I think is supported in part because of this verse. I will expand on this in a few moments. The last part of verse 35 says, and the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the last verse before Daniel begins his interpretation of this dream. It basically describes the statue's utter destruction as a result of the rock hitting its feet. It is also of extreme significance, as we will see, that the rock began very small and then became a mountain and filled the whole earth. It was not a mountain when it initially struck the statue, but over some amount of time, not discussed here, it grows to fill the whole earth. The next few verses read as follows, this is the dream. Now we will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and he has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. So when Daniel says here in verse 36, "This is the dream," he's declaring that he has accomplished phase 1 of Nebuchadnezzar's request. He told him what the dream was. He then declares his intention to begin phase 2, that is, telling the interpretation of the dream. This is also where I will begin to expand on this interpretation in depth. Oftentimes when there is symbolic prophecy in the Bible, like in the book of Revelation, there is an interpretation given of that symbolism in the Bible. In the book of Revelation, for example, an angel will tell us the meaning of John's vision about the woman riding the beast, for example. Also later on in the book of Daniel, we see angels giving literal interpretations of Daniel's symbolic visions. We must make sure that our interpretations of these symbolic visions are consistent with what Scripture tells us the interpretation of the vision is. It seems like a simple thing, but it's a sometimes overlooked hermeneutical principle. In verse 37, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, "The God of heaven has given you a kingdom." Daniel boldly speaks about the sovereignty of God here, telling Nebuchadnezzar that his kingdom was really given to him by Daniel's God. This was not necessarily an important part of the interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Daniel simply takes a risk here in telling the most powerful man on earth that he was really only a servant of Yahweh. Daniel may have seen this extraordinary circumstance as a perfect way to witness to the king. It is one of the many instances in this particular story that Daniel makes sure to let everyone know that this is because of God and not him. We will see later that this had the effect that Daniel intended, because we see Nebuchadnezzar bowing down and offering sacrifices to Yahweh at the end of this chapter. Daniel 2:38 says, "And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hand, and he has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold." The first part of this verse is defining the extent of the dominion God had given to Nebuchadnezzar, which is expressed as total, that is, all of the known world and everything in it. This is important because I think it shows, in part, that the following empires will also have a similar dominion, such as that of Babylon. That is, in order for a kingdom to qualify to be one of these parts of this statue, it must be a world-ruling empire. Here in verse 38 it says, "You are this head of gold." Here we begin to see that the statue's various materials represent kings or kingdoms. This is the only instance in this interpretation where Daniel refers to a person, that is, to a king instead of a kingdom. For instance, the very next verse says, "But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth." It becomes very clear as we progress in Daniel's interpretation that kingdoms are meant here and not necessarily kings, though in some cases it may apply to use them synonymously, like in the case of Nebuchadnezzar. And even then we can see in verse 39, which says, "But after you shall arise another kingdom," that Daniel intended to refer to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom even when he says, quote-unquote, "you." Stephen Miller in the New American Commentary writes concerning this next kingdom in verse 39, quote, "Daniel disclosed that another kingdom would arise after the Babylonian Empire. History is plain that the next great power to appear on the world scene was the Medo-Persian Empire, led by the dynamic Cyrus the Great. This empire is symbolized by the silver chest and arms of the great statue. Medo-Persia dominance continued for approximately 208 years, 539 to 331 BC. The Medes and Persians ruled together as one empire. This is even alluded to in other places in the book of Daniel. For example, in Daniel 8, verse 20, the two-horned ram, symbolizing one kingdom, represents the kings of Media and Persia, end quote. And in chapter 6, the author refers to the, quote, laws of the Medes and Persians, indicating that Darius ruled by the laws of the Medo-Persian Empire, not a separate Median kingdom. Daniel was an old man when Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great. The night of its conquest is detailed in chapter 5, with the feast of Belshazzar and the writing on the wall and all of that. Daniel's gifts were noticed by the Medo-Persians as well, and he went on to serve them for the few years before his death. Cyrus was also notable because it was him that allowed the exiled captive Jews to return to Israel. There's almost no disagreement among conservative scholars that the Medo-Persian Empire is in view here. The last part of verse 39 says, "A third kingdom of bronze which shall rule over all the earth." This kingdom of bronze is that of Greece. Alexander the Great conquered the known world, including the Medo-Persian Empire. This we know not just from secular history, but also because when the angel interprets a vision of Daniel in chapter 8 of a goat defeating a ram with 2 horns, it says the following. Daniel 8:20 and 21, "The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece, the large horn that is between its eyes is the first king." So not only do we know this from history, we have confirmation of the Bible's viewpoint from the very same book. And again, there's almost no disagreement among conservative scholars about the interpretation of the 3rd bronze section of this statue being Greece. Daniel 2 verse 40 says, "And the 4th kingdom shall be as strong as iron, insomuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others." And again, we have near universal agreement among conservative scholars as to the identity of the legs of iron, the Roman Empire. Miller says the following, "The image's legs of iron represent the empire that dominated the world after Greece, ancient Rome. 5 terms are utilized in this verse: breaks, smashes, breaks to pieces, crush, break, to emphasize the tremendous power this 4th kingdom would exert. Rome ruled the nations with an iron hand, and like a huge iron club shattered all who resisted its will. The Roman Empire dominated the world from the defeat of Carthage in 146 BC to the division of the East and West empires in AD 395, approximately 500 years. The last Roman emperor ruled in the West until AD 476. Before going into the next part about the feet and toes, where there are significant differences in beliefs among conservative scholars, I want to briefly explain the reason I keep saying, quote, agreement among conservative scholars, and not simply scholars, when referring to the interpretation of these kingdoms. The reason is that those who believe that prophecy is impossible as a part of their worldview cannot see any of this chapter as predictive prophecy, and they do have a different interpretation of these kingdoms as a result. But I won't be detailing their view here. If you would like to learn more about it, I would recommend the book that I've been referencing quite a lot. That is Stephen Miller's Daniel from the New American Commentary. He interacts quite a bit with that view at length. To make a long story short, though, since Rome was nothing more than an insignificant village at the time that Daniel wrote this, even by their liberal dating, they obviously can't have the legs of iron being Rome. So, by some funny business, they squeeze Greece into this final empire instead of Rome. But for those of us that can believe that God can see the past, present, and future, we are free to stand in awe of the accuracy in which God foretells the future. So, let's move on to the really challenging section of this prophecy. Daniel 2:41 through 43 says, "Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay." This is where there tends to be some disagreement among even conservative scholars. But before I get into that, let me talk about where everyone tends to agree. That is, that these feet and toes are somehow or another a part of the Roman Empire. In other words, the feet and toes mixed with iron and clay, while different from the iron legs, are not a part of a new kingdom, but still a part of the legs of iron of the Roman Empire, but just a chronologically later part, the end of the Roman Empire, if you will. Everyone tends to agree on that, but with many variations. Here are some of the main conservative views that people have about these feet and toes. View number 1, that the feet and toes represent the final part of the Roman Empire being divided and weak, trying to cleave its divided empire together, but failing. Another view is that the feet and toes represent the final kingdom of the Antichrist in the last days. There are many variations of both of these views, some of which we will talk about in depth as we progress. And another is that the feet and toes represent a Nephilim hybrid kingdom in the last days. We will talk about that in depth a little later as well. I used to hold to a version of the second and third view to a degree, the second being that the feet and toes were representing an end times kingdom and that there would be a need to revive the